25 years ago, I secretly bought a beach house. One day, my 82-year-old husband brought his 23-year-old mistress there. They were laughing, but when they opened the door, I was already waiting for them with my surprise. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Eleanor Marsh, and I was 78 years old the day I understood, with complete and terrible clarity, that the man I had given 54 years of my life to was a stranger. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where all stories worth telling begin. At the beginning, when everything still looked fine from the outside. Richard and I met in 1965 at a church social in Savannah, Georgia. He was 28, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident smile that made women forget their own names. I was 24, practical-minded, the daughter of a pharmacist who taught me that the only things in life you could truly count on were property and paperwork. We married 8 months later. I wore my mother's dress. He cried at the altar, or at least that's what I told myself for 50 years. Looking back, I think the light was just in his eyes. We built a life the way people did back then, slowly, stubbornly, brick by brick. Richard ran a regional insurance company. I raised our 3 children, Margaret, James, and Caroline, and taught elementary school for 31 years. We had a good house in Hilton Head, South Carolina. We had grandchildren who called on Sundays. We had routines that felt, if not passionate, then solid, reliable, like good furniture. But 25 years ago, something shifted in me. I don't know what exactly triggered it. Perhaps it was watching my friend Dorothy lose everything when her husband left her with nothing but credit card debt and a leased car. Perhaps it was simply the quiet, persistent knowledge that had lived in my chest for years, the knowledge I never let myself name. Whatever it was, in the spring of 1999, I did something I never told a single soul about. I bought a beach house. Not with our joint account. With money I had been setting aside since 1987. A private savings account in my maiden name, Eleanor Patton, at a bank 2 towns over. 31 years of birthday money, Christmas money, a small inheritance from my Aunt Ruth, and careful, patient saving. The house was a modest white clapboard cottage on Fripp Island. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, 40 yards from the water. I paid $214,000 cash. The deed was in my name alone. I told Richard it was a rental investment I'd inherited from Aunt Ruth's estate. He never asked to see the paperwork. He never did. For 25 years, that house sat quietly in my name, rented out through a local agency, paying its own property taxes, generating modest income I kept in a separate account. Richard knew the house existed in a vague, uninterested way, the way husbands know about things that don't directly concern them. He never went there. He never asked about it. And then, things began to change. It started the year Richard turned 80. Small things. A second cell phone, he said, was for work, though he had been retired for 12 years. Dinners that ran late. A new gym membership, which might have been touching if he hadn't pulled a muscle stepping off the porch the previous winter. A sudden interest in his appearance. New shirts, a different cologne, something sharp and young that didn't belong on an 80-year-old man. I noticed. I had always been a noticer, but I told myself the stories women tell themselves, that I was paranoid, that I was projecting, that men his age didn't, that it was impossible, that after 50 years, Then came the credit card statement I wasn't supposed to see. I found it by accident, slipped between two issues of his fishing magazine on the nightstand. A charge for $340 at a restaurant in Charleston I had never heard of. A charge for $189 at a jewelry store. A charge repeated 3 times over 4 months at a hotel on Fripp Island. On Fripp Island, where my house was. I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time, holding that piece of paper, feeling something drain out of me that I have never been able to fully name. It wasn't quite grief. It wasn't quite rage. It was more like the feeling of stepping onto what you thought was solid ground and finding nothing beneath your foot. I hired a private investigator 2 weeks later. His name was Dale Cummings, a retired sheriff's deputy from Beaufort County, and he was discreet, professional, and thorough. It took him 11 days. He sent me 3 photographs. In the first, Richard was walking along the Fripp Island waterfront with a young woman. In the second, they were sitting on a restaurant patio, her hand over his. In the third, and this is the one I have never been able to throw away, they were standing on the front porch of my beach house. My house. The white clapboard porch with the green shutters I had repainted myself in 2019. They were laughing. Her name, Dale told me, was Brittany Coles. She was 23 years old. She worked at a nail salon in Beaufort, and apparently Richard had been telling her that the beach house was his. A little gift, he called it. A place just for them. I read that report sitting at my kitchen table in Hilton Head, with my coffee going cold, and the morning sun coming through the window the way it always did, indifferent and bright. I thought about Dorothy. I thought about my father's advice. I thought about the deed locked in a safe deposit box at the First National Bank of Beaufort, with my maiden name typed neatly at the top. And then I thought, let them laugh. I had a few things to arrange first. The day after I received Dale's photographs, I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't confront Richard. I didn't cry. Or rather, I cried once, briefly, in the shower, where no one could hear me. And then I turned the water to cold and stood there until I could breathe normally again. What I did was sit down at my writing desk with a legal pad and a pen, and I made a list. I have always made lists. My students used to tease me about it, Mrs. Marsh and her lists. But lists are how I think. Lists are how I separate what is real from what is fear. And that morning, I needed very badly to know the difference. On the left side of the page, I wrote, what I have. The Hilton Head House. Purchased jointly in 1978. Current value approximately $890,000. Our joint savings account, which held just over $340,000. Richard's pension from the insurance company, which paid $4,200 a month. My teacher's pension, $1,850 a month. A joint investment portfolio worth roughly $280,000. And, separately, quietly, entirely mine, the Fripp Island Beach House, valued now at somewhere between $580,000 and $620,000, and the private savings account connected to it, which held $67,000. On the right side of the page, I wrote, what I could lose. And that list was longer than I wanted it to be. South Carolina is an equitable distribution state, not a community property state. That meant that in a divorce, assets would be divided fairly, which in practice meant a judge would look at the length of the marriage, the contributions of each spouse, and various other factors. After 54 years, with Richard's name on most of our shared assets, the outcome of a divorce was not guaranteed in my favor. A good lawyer could argue many things, Richard had always earned more. He had a habit of minimizing my contributions, the way men of his generation did. I had heard him say it at dinner parties, laughing, "Eleanor keeps the home fires burning," as if 31 years of teaching and raising 3 children was simply housekeeping. There was also the question of Richard himself. He was 82, in reasonable health for his age, but not robust. His memory had softened at the edges over the past 2 years. Nothing clinical, nothing diagnosed, but I had noticed. He repeated stories. He forgot appointments. He was, I now understood, with new and ugly clarity, deeply vulnerable to a young woman who knew how to be attentive. I didn't know what Brittany Coles wanted from him, but I could guess. And I could guess who would try to make sure she got it. I was afraid. I want to say that plainly, because I think women of my generation are expected to be either stoic or hysterical, and the truth is usually neither. I was genuinely frightened of losing the security I had spent a lifetime building, of being 78 years old and starting over, of what it would do to my children, to watch their parents' marriage dissolve in the most humiliating way possible. But underneath the fear, something else was hardening. I thought about the deed in that safe deposit box. I thought about the date on it. April 14th, 1999. 25 years before any of this. I had bought that house when Richard was still faithful, or when I had still believed he was. I had bought it with my own money, in my own name, as a quiet insurance policy against a future I hoped would never come. The future had come. The policy was about to be useful. I made an appointment with a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I called Patricia Holt, a friend from my book club who had practiced family law for 30 years before retiring. I didn't want to hire her. I didn't want anyone who knew me professionally to be my attorney. What I wanted was her recommendation. I took her to lunch at a quiet place in Bluffton, told her everything, and watched her expression move through surprise, anger on my behalf, and finally, that particular focused look that lawyers get when they are working. She gave me 3 names. She told me to call the first one, Sandra Weiss, a family law attorney in Beaufort, that afternoon. She also told me something I had already half known, but needed to hear from a professional. Because the Fripp Island property had been purchased entirely with premarital funds, money that had never touched our joint accounts. And because the deed had always been in my maiden name, and because Richard had never contributed to its mortgage, taxes, or maintenance, the house had a very strong argument for being classified as my separate property. My separate property. Richard could not touch it. More importantly, and this was where I began to see the full shape of what I needed to do, he could not give it away. Because that was what he had been doing, wasn't it? Standing on my porch, showing my house to a 23-year-old girl, letting her believe it was his to give. The arrogance of it was almost beautiful in a terrible way. He had no idea that the ground he was standing on belonged entirely to me. I called Sandra Weiss that afternoon. I told her I needed to understand my legal position before I made any moves. She was calm, thorough, and, as Patricia had promised, excellent. We met 2 days later in her office in downtown Beaufort. I brought the deed, the account records, 25 years of rental income statements, and Dale Cummings' report with the photographs. Sandra looked at everything carefully. Then she looked at me. "Mrs. Marsh," she said, "you have been more prepared for this moment than any client I have seen in 30 years of practice." I told her that my father was a pharmacist, that he had always said, "The best medicine is the one you took before you got sick." She smiled at that. Then she told me what I needed to do next. And sitting in that quiet office with the St. Helena Sound visible through the window and the afternoon light coming in gold and steady, I felt the fear in my chest begin, not to disappear, but to transform into something I could use. A plan has a shape. When you can see the shape of it, you can hold on to it. I could see the shape of mine. The first official step I took was also the quietest. On a Tuesday morning in October, I drove alone to the First National Bank of Beaufort, retrieved the deed from the safe deposit box, and had it reviewed by Sandra's paralegal to ensure it was properly recorded with the county. It was. Every detail was in order. Eleanor Ann Patton Marsh, my full legal name, listed as sole owner. The second step was less quiet, though Richard didn't know it yet. Sandra and I had agreed on a strategy. Before any divorce proceedings began, we would ensure that the beach house was formally appraised, its ownership status was documented in explicit legal memos, and that its rental history, 25 years of it, was compiled into a record that could withstand any legal challenge. We also contacted the rental agency on Fripp Island to ensure the property's management contract was current and unambiguous. It was. The house was legally mine, operationally mine, and financially mine in every way that mattered. But strategy is one thing. What I lived through during those weeks was another. I went home after each meeting with Sandra and sat across the dinner table from Richard, passing him the salt, asking about his golf game, listening to his stories about men I had met 100 times. And I watched him, the way you watch something you once loved that has become dangerous, carefully, without letting your eyes stay too long. He didn't notice at first, but somewhere around the third week, something shifted in him. I couldn't have told you exactly what tipped him off. Perhaps it was that I stopped asking where he'd been. Perhaps it was that I seemed, for the first time in years, genuinely unbothered. Richard had always needed my anxiety. My questions, my small frictions, had been the proof that I was still invested, still watching, still his. When I stopped providing them, he didn't know what to do with the silence. He started watching me back, little things. He would come into whatever room I was in and find some small task there, something to occupy his hands, an excuse to stay and observe. He checked the mail himself suddenly, when for 30 years he had left it to me. He asked twice in 1 week whether I had spoken recently to Margaret or James, probing, I understood, to see if I had said anything to the children. I hadn't. That was the one instruction Sandra had given me that I had followed without question. Tell no one in your family yet. Not until we had everything in order. Not until we were ready to move. Brittany, I learned, was less patient. Dale Cummings, still on a modest retainer, reported that she had been to the Hilton Head House. She had driven past it twice in 1 week, slowly, the way people do when they are studying something they think might soon be theirs. She was 23 years old and apparently very sure of the future, I thought about her a great deal during those weeks, not with the rage I might have expected. Rage, I have learned, requires energy, and I was spending mine on more useful things. What I felt was something closer to a cold, clinical curiosity. What did she see when she looked at my life? A house, a name, an old woman who could be waited out. The answer came to me sooner than I expected, and from a direction I hadn't anticipated. It was James who, without knowing he was doing anything significant, handed me the evidence I needed. James is my middle child, 49, an accountant, careful and thorough, the child most like me. He called on a Wednesday evening and mentioned, almost in passing, that his father had asked him a question about estate planning. Specifically, Richard had asked him whether, if a piece of property had been in one spouse's name for a long time, there was a way to transfer it jointly before the owner's death. I kept my voice even. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him I'd look into it," James said. Is there something I should know about, Mom? Is this about the beach house? So Richard knew, or suspected, that the beach house was mine, and he was already trying to find a way to claim it. After I hung up, I sat very still for a moment in the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. The evening birds were starting up outside. Normal sounds. Ordinary evening sounds from a life that was no longer what it appeared to be. Then I called Sandra. She was quiet for a moment after I told her. Then, "How much time do you think he'll give himself before he tries to formalize that request?" "Not much," I said. "He's 82. He doesn't think he has much time." "Then neither do we," she said. "Eleanor, it's time to file." I had one more call to make before then. I called Dale Cummings and asked him to obtain, if he legally could, any documentation of what Richard had been telling Brittany Coles about the Fripp Island property. What representation, if any, had he made to her about its ownership? Dale came back to me 4 days later. He had obtained, through sources I will not detail here but all entirely legal, a text message exchange between Richard and Brittany. In it, Richard had written, in plain language, that the beach house was his separate investment and that he was working on getting it set up properly for them both. I read those words standing in Sandra's office on a bright November morning, with the Atlantic a thin blue line visible through the window. His separate investment, my house, my 25 years, my Aunt Ruth's inheritance, and my 31 years of careful saving, and my name on the deed. His separate investment. I folded the printed page in half. "File," I said. Sandra filed the divorce petition on a Friday morning. I know it was a Friday because I remember standing in the parking lot of her office building afterward, watching a woman in a red coat walk a small dog along the sidewalk, and thinking, the world looks exactly the same. The petition cited irreconcilable differences. South Carolina is not a fault-based divorce state for most purposes, but the circumstances, the evidence, the text messages, the photographs from Dale's investigation would all become relevant to the equitable distribution of assets. More immediately, Sandra had filed a concurrent motion to establish the Fripp Island property as my separate property, citing the deed history, the source of funds, and the 25 years of sole ownership and management. The motion requested that the court issue a preliminary order preventing any transfer, encumbrance, or modification of the property's title, pending the outcome of the divorce proceedings. The court issued that order by Tuesday. Richard was served on Wednesday afternoon. I was not home when it happened. I had driven to Beaufort for a lunch I did not eat at a restaurant I cannot now name, because I could not be in that house when the process server arrived. Margaret had offered to come stay with me, but I had told her I needed the day alone. That was not entirely true, but it was what I could manage to say. I drove home along the coast road with the marsh grass moving in the October wind and the sky low and gray, and I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. Richard was sitting in the living room. He had the papers in his hands. He was not crying. He was not broken, not contrite, not the version of him I had spent 50 years knowing. He was, and I want to say this precisely because it mattered. He was furious in the way of a man who has been caught and is choosing to treat it as an attack rather than a consequence. "You went behind my back," he said. "Yes," I said. "I've learned from watching you." He told me I was being vindictive. He told me that at his age, 82, think about it, Eleanor, 82 years old, the stress of this kind of legal proceeding was medically dangerous. He told me that whatever I thought I knew, I didn't understand the full picture. He told me that Brittany was simply a friend, that I was overreacting, that I had always been suspicious and controlling. He actually used those words, standing in the living room of the house we had shared for 30 years, describing my careful, quiet attention as a character flaw. I let him finish. Then I told him, The Fripp Island house is under a court order. You cannot touch it. Your attorney will explain the rest. I went upstairs. I want to tell you it felt like triumph. It didn't. Not yet. What it felt like was the moment after you pull a splinter. Painful and clean and very, very raw. The calls started the next morning. The first was from Richard's lawyer, a man named Philip Garrett, based in Charleston, who had a reputation for being aggressive in high net worth divorces. He called my cell phone, which I did not answer, and left a message suggesting that Eleanor and Richard should speak directly before matters became unnecessarily complicated. I forwarded the message to Sandra. The second call was from Brittany. She called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered by accident, thinking it might be the rental agency on Fripp Island. Her voice was young. That was the thing that struck me first. How young she sounded. Not in a sympathetic way, but in the way of someone who has not yet learned that youth is not the same as power. She told me that Richard had done nothing wrong. She told me that what he and she had was real, and that I was trying to destroy something I had no right to touch. She told me, and here her voice changed slightly, took on a harder edge, that Richard was planning to contest the separate property designation on the beach house because he had invested in it over the years. When I asked her specifically what investment she meant, she said that he had paid for maintenance and improvements. He had not. I had every receipt, every contractor's invoice, every property tax statement going back 25 years. He had never paid for a single nail. I think, I told her, you should speak with Richard's attorney. She called back twice more that day. I didn't answer. But that evening, something happened that crossed a line. I came downstairs to find Richard at my writing desk where I kept my files. Going through the lower drawer, he had found a folder of property records. He was photographing pages with his phone. I stood in the doorway and looked at him. "Richard," I said, "put that down." He looked up, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked like someone I recognized, someone tired and old, and perhaps afraid. And then the moment passed, and he said, "These are marital records. I have every right." "You are photographing documents in an active legal proceeding," I said. "I am going to call Sandra in the morning, and then I am going to ask you to leave." He left the house 3 days later at Sandra's written request, which referenced potential contempt proceedings. He went, I later learned, directly to Brittany's apartment in Beaufort, and I stood alone in my house for the first time in 54 years. I gave myself 5 days. I did not call the lawyer. I did not check my email obsessively. I drove out to Fripp Island and sat on the porch of my beach house for 2 of those afternoons, watching the Atlantic, listening to the shorebirds, and letting myself feel, without managing it, everything that was happening. The 5th day, I made fresh coffee, called Sandra, and told her I was ready. Philip Garrett sent a settlement proposal on a Monday. I remember the day because it was the first truly cold morning of November, and the windows of Sandra's office were fogged at the edges when I arrived to review it. The proposal was, professionally speaking, almost insultingly constructed. It offered Eleanor Marsh 54 years of marriage, 3 children raised, 31 years in a classroom, a lump sum of $180,000, her teacher's pension, and the continued use of the Hilton Head House for a period of 5 years, after which the property would be sold and proceeds split 60-40 in Richard's favor. The joint investment portfolio would be divided equally. Richard would retain his insurance company pension in full. There was no mention of the beach house. It was simply absent from the document, as if by not naming it, they could make it cease to exist as a legal matter. I read the proposal twice. Then I set it down on Sandra's desk and looked at her. They don't believe the court order will hold, I said. Philip Garrett is testing your resolve, she said. This proposal is designed to make you feel lucky to receive anything. It's a pressure document, not a genuine offer. She was right, of course, but knowing a trap is a trap doesn't make it easier to look at. The $180,000 would not have lasted long. I was 78. Long-term care costs alone, if I ever needed them, could exhaust that in 3 years. Without the Hilton Head House, without the beach property, without a fair share of the assets I had helped build over 54 years, I would be an old woman, dependent on the goodwill of my children. That was what they were banking on, that I would be afraid enough to take it. I was afraid. I sat with the proposal folder on my lap during the drive home and felt, very specifically, the fear of being old and alone and outmaneuvered. It is a particular kind of fear. Not dramatic, not sharp. Just cold. Like a draft under a door. But I had been afraid before. I had been afraid in 1999 when I bought that house. Afraid that I was being paranoid. Afraid that Richard would find out. Afraid of what it meant that I felt I needed an escape route in my own marriage. Fear and I were old acquaintances. I declined the proposal. Sandra's response was 2 pages of clean legal language that essentially said, "This offer does not reflect the equitable value of Mrs. Marsh's marital contributions and is not a basis for negotiation." For 3 days after that, nothing happened. And somehow the silence was louder than anything Richard had said directly to me. I could feel them watching, Richard and Brittany and Philip Garrett, whoever else was involved, recalibrating, deciding what to try next. It was Caroline, my youngest, who first breached my silence about what was happening. She called on a Thursday evening. She had been calling more often since Richard left the house, sensing something without knowing its shape, the way children always can. I had told her only the minimum, that her father and I were separating, that it was serious, that I had legal support. That evening, she simply said, "Mom, are you alone in that house?" And something about the way she asked it, not with drama, just with plain care, made me say, "Come this weekend. Bring the kids." They came Saturday morning. Caroline, her husband Tom, and my 2 grandchildren, 11 and 8. The house filled up with noise and cereal bowls and a soccer ball somehow appearing in the back hallway. I sat at the kitchen table watching my grandchildren argue over the remote control, and I felt something I can only describe as solid. Weight in my feet. Ground under me. Caroline and I sat on the back porch that evening after Tom had taken the children to get ice cream. I told her most of it. Not the ugliest parts, not yet. But enough. The photographs, the text messages, the settlement proposal. She was very still for a moment. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough," I said. "And the beach house, all this time it was yours. Just yours." "Your great-aunt Ruth helped me buy it," I said. "And 30 years of clipping coupons." Caroline laughed at that. A short, startled sound. And then her eyes went bright, and she reached over and took my hand. "What do you need?" she said. I thought about it. "I need people to know I'm not crazy," I said. "And I need someone to sit with me when this gets harder." She squeezed my hand. "Done," she said. Patricia Holt, my book club friend, who had given me Sandra's name, organized it in her quiet way. She called Margaret and James separately and told them the basic facts, with my permission, before I had to. She also told 3 other women in our social circle, women who had known Richard and me for 20-plus years, women who had influence in the community, women whose esteem Richard valued. By the following week, 2 of those women had quietly informed Richard that they were aware of what had happened. They did not issue ultimatums. They simply let him know he was seen. His response filtered back to me through Patricia. He said I was making things up, building a false case against him out of wounded pride. I saved that quote in a notebook. Because wounded pride doesn't produce 25 years of receipts. Wounded pride doesn't put a deed in a safe deposit box. Wounded pride doesn't call a lawyer on a Tuesday afternoon and say, file. No. What produces those things is foresight and patience, and a father who was a pharmacist and believed that the best medicine is the one you take before you get sick. I was starting to feel a great deal better. They came on a Sunday. I had not been told they were coming. That was the first thing. The absence of warning, the way they simply appeared at the front door on a gray December morning, Richard in his good coat, and Brittany standing slightly behind him in a camel-colored jacket that cost more than my first car. I opened the door. I looked at them both. Richard said, "Eleanor, may we come in?" I should say something about what Brittany looked like in person. I had seen her only in photographs, profile shots, candid images from Dale's surveillance. In person, she was prettier than I had expected, with a kind of careful prettiness, the sort that requires maintenance and knows it. She held herself slightly apart, her expression calibrated to something that was probably meant to read as respectful. It read to me as calculated. I stepped back from the door. They sat in the living room, Richard in the armchair he had used for 30 years, which struck me as either habit or deliberate claim. Brittany sat beside him on the love seat, close but not touching, performing a particular kind of discretion. Richard spoke first. He said that this had all gotten out of hand. He said that he had been foolish. He actually used that word, the careful admission of small guilt designed to preclude the larger guilt from being named. He said that what he and Brittany had was complicated, but that none of it had to mean the end of 54 years. He said that there were ways to handle this that didn't involve attorneys and courts and putting everything we've built at risk. He said, "I think if you were willing to sit down and talk rationally," there it was. The word I had been waiting for. The word that meant, if you would stop insisting on your own reality and accept mine. I sat across from them with my hands in my lap and said nothing. I had learned, in 54 years of marriage and 31 years of teaching, that silence is a more powerful tool than most people give it credit for. When you stop filling the air, people fill it themselves. And they fill it with truth. Brittany spoke next. She said, "And I want to be careful to get this right, because it matters." She said that she understood this was painful for me. She said she had no desire to hurt anyone. She said that she hoped Eleanor could eventually understand that people's feelings were complicated and that love didn't follow the rules we expected it to. Then she said, "And really, for someone your age, it might be easier to accept a clean settlement and, not have to manage property. The beach house especially. That's a lot of responsibility." I looked at her for a moment. "How long have you been waiting," I said, "to say that to me?" Her expression changed, just slightly. The calibrated pleasantness shifted, and underneath it I saw something else. Not quite malice, but something related to it. Impatience. Entitlement. The absolute, unwavering belief that she was the one the story was supposed to go well for. Richard jumped in immediately. "That's not what she meant." "It's exactly what she meant," I said, "and I'd like you to hear my answer." I looked at Brittany directly. "I bought that house with my own money in 1999. My name is on the deed. A court has acknowledged its legal status. Your feelings about it, and I do mean your feelings, Miss Coles, are not a legal argument." Silence. Then Richard leaned forward. And here is where the mask fully came off. Not dramatically, not with shouting, but in the particular cold way of a man who is used to being obeyed. He said, "Eleanor, I'm asking you, as your husband of 54 years, to stop this before it goes any further. Philip tells me we have several legal avenues regarding that property that you may not have considered. This can become very expensive for you, very drawn out, very public. I heard clearly what he was not quite saying. He was not quite saying, give up the beach house and we will let you have the rest quietly. He was not quite saying, resist us and we will make this cost you more than it's worth. He was not quite saying, you are old and tired and this will outlast you. He was, in other words, threatening me. In my living room, on a Sunday morning. I'll see you in court, I said. He stood. He straightened his coat. That gesture, that habitual smoothing, which I had watched him perform after every difficult conversation for 5 decades. He said very quietly, don't do this, Eleanor. Brittany was already moving toward the door. I walked them out. I stood on the porch and watched Richard's car, a car I had never seen before, something new, something he had apparently bought sometime in the last year without mentioning it, pull out of the driveway and move down the street until I couldn't see it anymore. Then I went inside, locked the front door, and sat down on the bottom step of the stairs. I am not going to pretend I was unmoved. I sat there for 10 minutes with something cold moving through my chest. Not second thoughts. Not that, not exactly. But a clear-eyed understanding of what he had shown me. That the man I had married was prepared to use a court system, an attorney, and a 23-year-old woman as instruments to strip away what I had built. That he was, at 82 years old, not contrite and not finished. That was frightening. It was also the most clarifying thing that had happened since I first opened that credit card statement. Because if he was still fighting this hard, if he thought there was still something to fight for, then I was doing exactly the right thing. I picked up my phone and sent Sandra a text. They came to the house today. Attempted persuasion, some veiled threat re legal costs. I want to discuss our timeline. I think we should move faster. She responded within the hour. Agreed. I'll call you tomorrow morning. I made myself tea. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the neighbor's oak tree moving in the December wind. The light was thin and gray and absolutely ordinary. I thought, 25 years ago, I bought a house with money I saved in secret. And I thought, I knew, even then, what kind of man I'd married. I just hadn't let myself say it yet. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of January. I dressed carefully that morning. Not performatively. I was not dressing for anyone in the room, not trying to appear sympathetic or frail or impressive. I wore the gray wool suit I had bought for Margaret's eldest child's christening and my mother's pearl earrings, and I took my time over both because I had learned that the rituals of preparation matter in the same way that a surgeon's focus matters before an incision. They are not vanity. They are discipline. Sandra had spent the preceding 6 weeks building a record that was, she told me, the cleanest she had worked with in her career. We had the original deed, dated April 14th, 1999, in my maiden name. The full chain of title documentation showing no transfer or joint ownership at any point. Bank records showing the purchase was funded entirely from my private savings account, which itself could be traced to sources entirely separate from our marital finances. My Aunt Ruth's estate, my personal savings over 12 years, rental income from the property itself, 25 years of property tax payments, all in my name alone. Contractor invoices, maintenance records, rental contracts, every document showing a sole owner managing a sole property. We had Philip Garrett's settlement proposal, which had notably omitted the beach house entirely, suggesting that even he had recognized at some level the weakness of their position regarding it. And we had the text messages, Richard's own words, his separate investment, his own claim, his own fraudulent representation to Brittany Coles that property belonging entirely to his wife was his to convey. I sat in the courtroom and placed my hands flat on the table in front of me and breathed. Richard sat across the aisle with Philip Garrett. He was wearing a suit I had not seen before. Dark blue, well cut. The suit of a man trying to project authority. He did not look at me when he came in. Brittany was not in the courtroom. This was a civil hearing, not a trial, and she had no formal role here. But I knew she was waiting. Somewhere. She was waiting. Philip Garrett went first. He was polished and aggressive, as Patricia had promised, and he made 3 arguments with considerable skill. The first, that Eleanor had conducted a secret financial transaction during the marriage using funds accumulated during the marriage, which could be characterized as marital assets. The second, that Richard had contributed to the property indirectly through the financial support that had allowed Eleanor to save. The third, that the couple's intention in their overall estate could be construed as unified, making the technical separation of the deed a legal formality rather than a genuine reflection of ownership. They were not bad arguments. I want to say that because I believe in giving credit where it is due. Philip Garrett was a skilled attorney, making the best case available to him. The problem was the evidence. Sandra addressed each point in turn. The savings account predated the marriage's peak income years and had been maintained in my maiden name for its entirety. The source of funds was traceable to my personal inheritance and my teaching salary, documented, verified, and never commingled with joint finances. Richard had been given the opportunity over 25 years to contribute to or be documented in connection with the property, and had not been. Not his name, not his money, not a single transaction. The rental income had flowed into my private account and had been used for property maintenance and reinvestment. Then Sandra put the text messages on the record. Philip Garrett objected. He was overruled. The judge read them quietly. I watched her face. A careful, even face. A judge who had been on the family court bench for 16 years. She read the messages twice. Then she asked Philip Garrett, "Is your client's position that these messages represent a misunderstanding?" There was a pause, the kind of pause that fills a room. Philip Garrett said carefully that his client had made some informal statements that may not have reflected the precise legal ownership status of the property. The judge looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Richard, and something happened to Richard's face. The authority slipped. I watched it go. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, like a wall showing cracks. The composed, confident expression became effortful, and then the effort became visible, and then it stopped working. What was left underneath was something I had not seen on his face in many years. Uncertainty. Real uncertainty. The kind that comes when a man realizes the story he has been telling has just met the facts. He started to speak. "Your Honor," Richard said, and then stopped. Philip Garrett put a hand on his arm, a small, practiced gesture. "Stop talking." Richard did not stop. "The house was, I always understood that. Eleanor and I had an agreement about—" "Mr. Marsh," the judge said, not unkindly, but firmly. He stopped. I sat very still. I did not look at him with triumph. I did not look at him with pity. I looked at him the way you look at a thing that is finished, with a kind of sad, comprehensive clarity. After the hearing in the corridor, I saw Philip Garrett speaking to Sandra in a low, rapid voice. I didn't hear the words, but I recognized the posture of a man recalibrating what he can reasonably ask for. Sandra came to me afterward and said 4 words. "He's going to settle." I nodded. "On your terms," she added. I looked out the window of the corridor at the January light on the street outside, cold and clean and very clear. I thought of the beach house on Fripp Island, with its green shutters and its porch, and the shorebirds wheeling over the water. Yes, I said, he will. The settlement was finalized in February, on a Thursday, in Sandra's office. I want to describe the room, because I find that I remember it very clearly, and I think that is because the body knows when a moment is final, even before the mind catches up. Sandra's office had cream-colored walls and a view of a live oak that had grown too large for the space around it, and was magnificent because of it. There were stacks of documents on the conference table, a carafe of water, 2 glasses, Sandra at the head of the table, Philip Garrett across from us, looking like a man who had accepted an unpleasant meal and was finishing it because he was too professional not to. Richard was not present. He had been advised not to be. That absence, that empty chair, told me everything I needed to know about where he was emotionally and strategically. He was gone from the room in the same way he was gone from our life. Suddenly, after 54 years, just not there. The terms took 3 weeks to negotiate after the hearing. Philip Garrett had initially tried to reassert some of their original positions. Sandra had responded to each attempt with documentation. He had tried to argue the beach house one final time, citing a legal theory about beneficial interest that Sandra had anticipated and was prepared to dismantle. He had tried to revisit the division of the investment portfolio. He had tried to soften the pension terms. Each attempt ran into the same wall. The evidence. 25 years of meticulous documentation. A deed that had never wavered. Text messages in Richard's own handwriting that demonstrated he had known, had always known, exactly whose house it was, even as he told a young woman otherwise. In the end, the terms were these. The Fripp Island beach house was confirmed as my separate property, removed from the marital estate entirely. It was mine, completely, legally, finally mine. The Hilton Head House, our marital home of 30 years, was to be sold. From the proceeds, I would receive 60%, reflecting my longer financial contribution to its acquisition and maintenance, documented through records Sandra had compiled. Richard would receive 40%. The joint investment portfolio was divided equally. Richard retained his insurance company pension. I retained my teacher's pension. In addition, and this was the point that had taken the longest to reach, the point where Philip Garrett had been most resistant, Richard agreed to a lump sum payment of $95,000 to Eleanor, representing the court's recognition of contributions to the marriage that had not been otherwise compensated in the asset division. I signed my name at the bottom of the final page at 2:47 in the afternoon. Afterward, I learned things I had not known before, things that surfaced as part of the financial disclosure process that divorce requires. Richard had transferred $43,000 from a personal investment account to Brittany Coles over the preceding 14 months. Not to a joint account, not in any instrument that would have made it a recoverable marital asset under South Carolina law, but directly to her, cash transfers, multiple transactions, each just under the reporting threshold. I had suspected. I had not known the number. I also learned that he had co-signed a lease on Brittany's apartment in Beaufort, the same apartment he had moved into when he left our house. The lease was in both their names. He was paying the bulk of the rent. These things were not recoverable from him, legally. The money was gone. The lease was a private matter. But they were relevant to understanding the full picture. What he had been doing, how long he had been doing it, and what he had been willing to spend on the proposition that he could give away what was mine. I did not allow myself to be angry about the $43,000 in the way I might have been angry before the settlement. There is a quality of feeling that sets in after a long legal process. Not quite peace, not quite exhaustion, but something in between. A settling, like sediment after water stills. What I had was this: a legal acknowledgement of my ownership of a property I had bought with my own foresight and my own hands, a fair division of what we had built together, financial security that would not evaporate, my name, Eleanor Ann Patton Marsh, on documents that said this was hers, and I had something harder to name, but equally real: the knowledge that 25 years ago, a younger version of myself had known something she wasn't ready to say yet, and had acted on that knowledge quietly and carefully, and had been right. Sandra walked me to my car afterward. The February air was cool and smelled of the marsh. She said, "Eleanor, you should be proud of how you handled this." I thought about it for a moment. "My father told me," I said, "that the best medicine is the one you take before you get sick." I opened my car door. "I just wish I'd been wrong enough that I never needed it." She nodded. She understood. I drove home along the coast road, the same road I had driven the day Richard was served. The marsh grass was brown and still in the winter light, and the water was gray and very flat. I drove to Fripp Island. I parked in front of my house, with its white clapboard and its green shutters and its wraparound porch. I sat in the car for a moment. Then I got out, walked up the porch steps, unlocked the door with my key, and went inside. The house smelled of wood and salt, and the particular quiet of a place that has been well maintained and patiently waited. I sat in the chair by the front window and looked out at the Atlantic and let the silence happen around me. That was enough. The Hilton Head House sold in April. I had not been sorry to see it go. I moved into the Fripp Island cottage in May. All 3 children came to help. We ate pizza on the porch, watched the grandchildren chase shorebirds until their voices became small with distance. Caroline said that first evening, "This place suits you, Mom." I looked at the water. "I know," I said. That September, I traveled alone to Maine for the first time in 40 years. I called Patricia from a rocky headland with the Atlantic enormous below me. "I feel like a person," I told her. "You were always a person, Eleanor." "I know, but now I feel like one." My grandchildren visited constantly. My house had become a place people wanted to come. That is the truest thing I can say. Richard and Brittany lasted 8 months. By autumn, she had moved to Charleston. He moved into assisted living. His children arranged it. I visited once. When I stood to leave, he said, "You were always more prepared than I gave you credit for." "Yes," I said. "I was. Warm, quiet, entirely mine." That is the story of the beach house, of a deed in a safe deposit box and a savings account in my maiden name. What did I learn? That preparation is the deepest form of self-respect, that legal rights exist to be used, that patience, quietly kept, is more powerful than any confrontation. If something inside you says protect yourself, listen to it. Would you have done what I did? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave a comment below. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves. My 3 children conspired to take everything I had built over 50 years. They thought I was old and didn't understand anything. I stood behind the door and heard every single word. The next morning, I did something that made them all go pale. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Callahan, and I am 74 years old. I want to tell you a story, not a pretty one, not a comfortable one, but one that is entirely true. It is the story of how the 3 people I loved most in this world decided that I had outlived my usefulness and how I proved them wrong. I spent 50 years building something, not a fortune, mind you. Nothing so grand as that, but something real. My late husband Gerald and I bought our house on Maple Creek Road in 1974, the year after we married. We paid for it slowly, painfully, with Gerald's salary from the machine shop and my income from the elementary school where I taught second grade for 31 years. We raised our children in that house. Linda, the oldest, then Robert, then Patricia, the baby. We replaced the roof twice, the furnace once, repainted the shutters every decade. Gerald planted the oak tree in the backyard the year Robert was born. That tree is now 46 years old, taller than the house itself. Gerald died in 2019. Heart attack. Sudden. On a Tuesday morning in March. He was 71. We had been married 46 years. After he was gone, the house felt enormous, every room an echo. But I did not consider leaving it. That house was my life. It was the last place I had been truly, completely happy, and I was not ready to surrender it. My children were attentive at first. They called regularly. Linda drove up from Richmond every few weeks. Robert, who lived only 20 minutes away in Fairfield, stopped by on Sundays. Patricia, the youngest, called from Denver every Saturday morning. I was grateful. I told myself, look at what Gerald and I raised. Good people, loving people. The first warning sign, if I am being honest, came about 8 months after Gerald's funeral. It was subtle. So subtle that I dismissed it at the time. Linda mentioned, very casually, over coffee at my kitchen table, that she had spoken with a financial advisor about estate planning for older parents. She said it warmly, with that lovely Richmond smile of hers. She said she only wanted to make sure I was protected. I thanked her. I did not think twice about it. The second sign came that winter. Robert suggested I might be happier in a senior community. He had brochures. He had printed them, organized them into a folder, labeled with sticky notes. He had done research. He presented it the way a salesman presents a product. Gently, but with clear preparation. I told him I was fine. He nodded and put the folder away. But his eyes lingered on the walls of my living room, the way a buyer's eyes linger at an open house. Patricia began calling less on Saturdays and more on Tuesdays. The same day each week, always asking the same questions. How was I feeling? Any dizziness? Any confusion? Had I seen Dr. Marsh recently? Her concern felt scripted in a way I could not quite name. By spring of last year, the three of them were visiting together more often, which had never been their habit before. They would gather in the kitchen while I was resting, speaking in low voices. I told myself they were coordinating, the way adult children coordinate, dividing responsibilities. I told myself this because I wanted it to be true. Then came the night I found out the truth. It was a Thursday in April. I had gone to bed early with a headache, but I could not sleep, and around 10 o'clock I came downstairs for a glass of water. Linda, Robert, and Patricia were in the living room. The door was nearly closed. I stopped in the hallway, and I stood there in the dark in my slippers, and I listened. Linda was speaking. Her voice was not the warm Richmond voice I knew. It was flat and businesslike, the voice of someone running a meeting. She's not going to agree willingly, Linda said. So we have to move before she understands what's happening. The house alone is worth $400,000. With the accounts, we're looking at close to $600 total. She trusts her own name on things, Robert said. That's the problem. We need her to sign the power of attorney before she gets suspicious. She won't fight it, Patricia said. She's old. She gets tired. If we present it right, she'll sign and think she's doing the sensible thing. I stood in that dark hallway, and I did not move. I did not breathe. I counted the flowers on the hallway wallpaper, the same wallpaper Gerald and I had chosen in 1989, and I waited until my heart stopped slamming against my ribs. Then I walked quietly back upstairs, sat down on the edge of my bed, and I thought, so this is what it has come to. I did not cry that night. I was too angry to cry. I sat on that bed until 2 in the morning. Below me, I could hear the muffled sounds of my children leaving. Linda's car first, then Patricia's rental, then Robert's truck. The house went quiet, and I sat in that quiet, and I took stock of everything. What exactly did I have? I went through it in my mind the way you go through a filing cabinet, methodically, without flinching. The house on Maple Creek Road, paid in full since 2001. Gerald's life insurance payout, which I had invested conservatively, about $140,000 in a Fidelity account. My teacher's pension, modest but steady, just over $1,800 a month. A savings account with roughly $42,000. My car, a 2018 Honda Accord. Gerald's woodworking tools in the garage, which I had kept because I could not bear to part with them. A small collection of jewelry. Nothing spectacular, but sentimental, and worth perhaps $8,000 or $9,000 at appraisal. $600,000. That was what Linda had said. Close to $600 total. She had counted my life like a grocery bill. And the power of attorney. That was what frightened me most. A durable power of attorney signed in a moment of tired compliance would give whoever held it the legal authority to manage my finances, make decisions about my property, even arrange for my care. It was the key to everything. If I signed it, believing, as Patricia had said, that I was simply doing the sensible thing, they could move money, sell the house, place me somewhere comfortable and out of the way, and there would be very little I could do about it afterward. I am a retired school teacher, not a lawyer. But I had lived 74 years, and I had not done so by being a fool. The fear came in waves that night. It was not a sharp, dramatic fear. It was the cold, creeping kind, the kind that settles in your bones. These were my children. Linda had been a colicky baby, and I had walked her for hours in the dark. Robert had broken his arm at 10 falling from Gerald's oak tree, and I had held his hand in the emergency room. Patricia had called me sobbing from a college dormitory at 19 when her first serious boyfriend ended things, and I had driven 4 hours to be with her. These were people I had held, people I had bled for, in the quiet, ordinary way that mothers bleed. And they had sat in my living room and discussed how to take everything from me. By the time the first light came through the curtains, I had made my decision. I was not going to run. I was not going to confront them in a panic and give them the opportunity to reassure me and regroup. I was going to be smarter than they expected a tired old woman to be. I had one immediate advantage. They did not know I had heard them. My first instinct was to call someone, a friend, a neighbor. But I stopped myself. Any conversation could be reported back. Linda, in particular, was friendly with my neighbor Cecile, who lived 3 doors down and had a sympathetic ear and a loose tongue. No, I needed to be careful. I needed to think before I spoke. I made myself a cup of coffee. I sat at Gerald's kitchen table, the one he had built himself from reclaimed barnwood, the one I had sat at every morning for 30 years. And I wrote in a notepad. Not a diary, nothing sentimental. A list, what they want, what they plan to do, what I need to stop it. What they wanted was clear. Control of my assets and ultimately my property. What they planned was equally clear. Maneuver me into signing documents that would strip me of legal authority over my own life. What I needed was a lawyer, not a family friend, not someone who had ever met Linda or Robert or Patricia. And I needed one before they made their next move. I also needed to know what I was dealing with legally. Was what they were describing elder financial abuse fraud, or simply aggressive estate planning that, while morally repugnant, was not yet technically illegal? I did not know. That was the next thing to find out. I looked at my notepad. I had always taught my second graders that the first step to solving any problem was to write it down and look at it clearly. I had been right about that. Written down, my situation was frightening. But it was not hopeless. I was still legally competent. I still owned everything in my own name. I had not signed anything, and I intended to keep it that way. I had not been inside a law office in 11 years. Not since Gerald and I had updated our wills after Patricia's wedding. That had been a pleasant enough occasion, sitting across from a mild-mannered man named Harold Sutter, who specialized in estate planning and smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. Harold had retired, I knew. I was going to need someone new. I did not Google lawyers from my home computer. I did not want that search history anywhere near a device my children might someday access. Instead, I drove to the public library on Wednesday morning, sat down at one of the public terminals in the back corner, and spent an hour researching elder law attorneys in our county. I was looking for someone with experience in elder financial abuse and asset protection, someone who had seen situations like mine before. I found her on the third page of results. Margaret Ossie, J.D., a partner at Ossie and Brandt, specializing in elder law, guardianship disputes, and estate litigation. Her firm was in Millbrook, 22 miles from Maple Creek Road, far enough that it was unlikely any of my children would drive past and see my Honda in the parking lot. Her reviews mentioned phrases like fierce advocate and doesn't back down. I wrote her number on a slip of paper, folded it into my coat pocket, and drove home. I called from my cell phone, parked in the far corner of the Kroger parking lot, engine running. Margaret Ossie's assistant answered. I explained that I needed a consultation urgently, that I was a 74-year-old woman with concerns about family members attempting to gain unauthorized control of my finances. The assistant put me on hold for 90 seconds. When she came back, she gave me an appointment for Friday at 10. In the 2 days before that appointment, I noticed the first signs that my children were beginning to sense a shift in atmosphere, though they could not have known why. Linda called on Thursday afternoon, chipper and casual, mentioning that she had been speaking with a lovely woman at an estate planning firm in Richmond who had such good ideas for families in our situation. She asked whether I had given any more thought to the power of attorney paperwork. I told her I had not been feeling well and I would think about things next week. She said, "Of course. No rush. Take care of yourself." Her voice was warm. Her voice was always warm. Robert texted that evening. "Just checking in, Mom. Let me know if you need anything." A text he had never sent in his life before the past 8 months. I kept my face neutral. I kept my voice easy. And on Friday morning, I drove to Millbrook. Margaret Ossie was 50-something, compact, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She had the kind of stillness that made you feel she had heard everything and was surprised by nothing. I sat across from her mahogany desk and I told her everything. The overheard conversation, word for word as best I could reconstruct it. The brochures for senior communities. The questions about my cognitive health. The coordinated visits. The sudden, organized interest in estate planning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Mrs. Callahan, what you've described is a textbook setup for elder financial exploitation. It's not yet a crime, but it will be if they succeed in obtaining that power of attorney under false pretenses or through undue influence." She explained my options. She recommended 3 immediate actions. First, she would draft a new will, one that explicitly reflected my current wishes, and was witnessed and notarized outside any family involvement. Second, she would help me establish a revocable living trust, which would place my house and accounts under managed terms that could not be easily altered by anyone I did not explicitly authorize. Third, she strongly advised that I document everything, all conversations, all texts, all voicemails, and keep those records somewhere outside my home. I left her office 2 hours later with a folder of intake paperwork and the first solid ground I had felt beneath my feet since April. That same afternoon, I received the first direct evidence of my children's plans. And it arrived not through eavesdropping, but through an entirely ordinary mistake. Patricia, who sometimes muddled her contacts, sent me a text, clearly meant for Linda. It read, "She hasn't signed anything yet. R says she seemed distracted on the phone. We need to move faster. Should we call Dr. Marsh and mention the confusion episodes?" I read it 3 times. Then I took a screenshot. Then I forwarded it to Margaret Osei's email. Confusion episodes. There were no confusion episodes. But if they could plant that idea with my physician, suggest to Dr. Marsh that I was showing signs of cognitive decline, it could become the foundation for a legal argument that I lacked capacity to manage my own affairs. That was the play. That was the whole play. I sat in my car in the Kroger lot again. It had become my thinking spot, that far corner by the cart return, and I breathed slowly and steadily. I thought, now I understand exactly what I am dealing with. The trust documents took 10 days to finalize. During those 10 days, I lived a quiet double life. On the surface, I was the same mother I had always been, answering calls, responding to texts, accepting Robert's Sunday visits with coffee and pound cake from the bakery on 5th. Underneath, I was working. Margaret had connected me with a fee-only financial advisor named Charles Webb, a calm, methodical man in his 60s who helped me reorganize my accounts. We moved my Fidelity investments into the Living Trust. The savings account was retitled. Margaret drafted the new will, which named not my children, but my niece, Carolyn, Gerald's brother's daughter, a level-headed woman of 48 who lived in Asheville and had no stake in my estate beyond whatever I chose to give her, as executor. I also updated my healthcare proxy to name Carolyn rather than Linda, who had held that designation for 12 years. I did all of this quietly, in offices 20 miles from home, paying with a check drawn from an account my children had no knowledge of. A small account I had maintained at a credit union since the early 90s, a relic of the years when I had kept a small household fund separate from our joint account. Gerald had known about it. My children had not. It held about $6,000, more than enough. The moment everything came apart in their direction was a Tuesday in May. Linda called in the morning with a document attached to an email. A power of attorney form, pre-filled with my name, asking me to simply review and sign in front of a notary she had conveniently arranged at a location near my home. Her email explained that this was just a precaution, completely standard for someone your age, nothing to worry about. She included a note from Robert at the bottom, endorsing the idea, and a short paragraph from Patricia saying how much peace of mind it would give the family. I forwarded the email to Margaret. Then I called Linda and said very calmly that I had been thinking about estate matters myself and had already made some arrangements. I mentioned, also calmly, that I had retained an attorney. The pause on the other end of that call lasted approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, I could almost hear the machinery of Linda's composure seizing up. "An attorney," she repeated. "Yes," I said. "Margaret Osei, in Millbrook. Very capable woman." Another pause. "Mom, that seems... we're family. You don't need to get lawyers involved in family matters." "I think I do," I said pleasantly. "She's helped me get everything sorted out very nicely." Linda said she had to go, She hung up. Within 48 hours, all three of them were at my door. They arrived on a Thursday evening, uninvited. Linda knocked. She had never knocked before, had always let herself in, which told me she was already on uncertain footing. I opened the door and looked at three faces arranged in a tight, coordinated concern. They came in, they sat in my living room, and then Linda dropped the pretense of warmth entirely. "You've changed the will," she said. It was not a question. "I've done a number of things," I said. "Mom?" Robert leaned forward, elbows on knees. "We are trying to protect you. You're alone out here. What happens if something happens to you? What happens if I become confused?" I said. I watched his face carefully. "Like Patricia mentioned to Linda in that text message?" Patricia went white, and in that moment, that single clarifying moment, every remaining doubt I had ever felt dissolved completely. What followed was not a pleasant conversation. Linda accused me of being manipulated by strangers with financial interests. Robert said that Carolyn, whom he barely knew, had no business being involved in our family. Patricia cried, which had always been her most effective weapon and which now landed like rain on stone. I sat in Gerald's armchair and I listened, and when they had finished, I said, "I understand you're upset, but what you were planning is not going to happen. If anyone contacts Dr. Marsh with false information about my cognitive health, Margaret will know about it within the hour. If anyone attempts to file any legal document on my behalf without my explicit written consent, I have already spoken with her about next steps." The room went very quiet. They left. They did not slam the door, which surprised me. Linda paused on the porch and turned back with an expression I had never seen on her face. Something that was not anger exactly, but the close cousin of it. Something humiliated and calculating. After they drove away, I locked the door and sat down in the kitchen. My hands were trembling slightly. I was 74 years old, and I had just confronted my three children with their own plan to rob me. I poured myself 2 fingers of Gerald's bourbon, the good bottle I kept on the top shelf, and I drank it slowly. I gave myself 3 days. 3 days of not answering calls beyond a brief text to say I was resting. 3 days of walking in the backyard, sitting under Gerald's oak, reading novels, watching old films. I had earned those 3 days. The enticement came on the 5th day. Linda sent flowers. Not just any flowers. She sent a large arrangement from Hillcroft Florist, the same shop where Gerald had ordered my birthday bouquets for 40 years. Stargazer lilies and white roses, my favorites. The card read, "We love you, Mom. We're sorry things got tense. Can we start over?" All 3 names were signed. I put the flowers on the kitchen table and looked at them for a long time. They were genuinely beautiful. And that was precisely the point, wasn't it? They knew my preferences, my soft places, the memories attached to certain flowers from a particular shop. They were not sorry. They were recalibrating. A day later, Robert called. His voice was low and gentle, the voice he used when he wanted something. I had recognized it since he was 14. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he realized they had gone about things the wrong way. He said he only wanted to know that I was taken care of. He floated, almost as an afterthought, the idea of a family meeting. Just the 4 of us, no attorneys, keeping it in the family. "I'll think about it," I told him. I said it with warmth. I had no intention of thinking about it. Patricia texted a long message. Very long, the kind she sent when she was working through guilt or performing guilt and could not easily be interrupted. She spoke of her childhood, of memories in that house, of how much she missed her father. It was, I admit, beautifully written. Patricia had always been the most talented of the three, and somewhere in the middle of it, between the memory of Christmas mornings and the note about missing Gerald's voice, was a gentle suggestion that perhaps I should consider simplifying my arrangements, that the trust and the new will might be creating unnecessary complications for the family. Simplifying. What a word to choose. I read the message twice, filed it in a folder on my phone that I had labeled plainly documentation, and sent it to Margaret. What I needed now was not legal advice. I had that. What I needed was the kind of support that doesn't come from attorneys or financial advisors, the kind that comes from people who know you and do not want anything from you. I called my friend Beverly. Beverly Hutchins and I had taught third and second grade side by side at Crestwood Elementary for 19 years. She was 71, still sharp as a tack, and she had lost her own husband 4 years before me. I drove to her house on a Wednesday afternoon and sat in her kitchen, which smelled of coffee and the oatmeal cookies she made every week, and I told her everything. Beverly listened the way only old friends listen, without surprise and without drama. When I finished, she put her hand over mine on the table and said, "Dorothy, I need you to hear me. What they're doing has a name, and you are handling it exactly right." She was not the only one I reached out to. My neighbor, Frank DeLuca, 76, widower, former contractor, sharp eyes, and not much patience for nonsense, had noticed the increased traffic at my house and quietly asked if everything was all right. I told him enough that he understood. Frank said he would keep an eye on things. He meant it practically, and I was grateful for the practicality. At church that Sunday, First Methodist on Greenbrier, where Gerald and I had attended for 30 years, I spoke briefly with Pastor Ann Cortland after the service. I did not give her details, but I told her I was going through a difficult family situation and would appreciate her prayers. She held my hands, looked me steadily in the eye, and said, "Dorothy, you are one of the strongest women I know. Trust yourself." I drove home with the windows down, even though it was cool, because I needed the air on my face. I thought about what it meant to have people, real people, people who remembered you before you became a problem to be managed. Beverly, Frank, Pastor Ann, Margaret, Charles. I was not alone. I had not been alone this whole time. I had simply forgotten to look up from my fear long enough to see who was standing beside me. They came on a Saturday afternoon in June, 11 days after the flowers and the phone calls and Patricia's long text message. All three, again. Linda brought a coffee cake from the bakery. My bakery, the one on 5th. Robert held the door for her, and Patricia carried a small arrangement of sunflowers. They had dressed well. They had prepared. Standing on my porch in a row, they looked like a photograph from a family calendar. Warm, coordinated, wholesome. It was an impressive production. I had to give them that. I had known they would come. Beverly had warned me. They'll try once more to do it nicely before they escalate or give up entirely. Be ready. I let them in. I made coffee. I set out plates for the cake because I was still their mother, and some habits are older than betrayal. We sat in the living room, the same living room where, 2 months ago, I had stood in the dark hallway and heard my life being divided up like furniture at an estate sale. I sat in Gerald's armchair. They arranged themselves on the sofa and the love seat, close together, a unified front with a veneer of warmth. The sunflowers Patricia had brought sat in a vase on the side table, bright and cheerful, entirely out of place. Linda opened. She was very good at opening. "Mom," she said, setting her mug down with deliberate care, "we've all had time to reflect, and we want to say that we understand why you felt frightened. We handled things clumsily. We came on too strong. But our intentions, our real intentions, have always been about love and protection." She paused. She waited for me to fill the silence with reassurance, the way I had filled silences for 50 years of motherhood. I did not. "The trust," Robert continued, picking up the thread smoothly. "They had rehearsed this. I could feel the seams of it. It's actually quite limiting. Did Margaret explain all the implications? There are tax situations and long-term care scenarios that a trust can complicate. We've spoken to a specialist, and he agrees that a simpler arrangement would actually protect you better." A specialist. They had hired a counter-expert. They had spent money on this. The calculation behind that decision told me everything I needed to know about how much they still believed they could win. "We just want what's best for you," Patricia said softly. Her eyes were moist. They were always moist when she needed them to be. "We're your children. We've known you our whole lives. Some attorney you just met doesn't know you the way we do. She doesn't know how Dad used to finish your sentences or how you still sleep on your side of the bed even though he's gone. She doesn't know you, Mom. We do." It was a beautiful appeal. Patricia had always been the most talented of the three, and she brought that talent to spoken manipulation as naturally as breathing. She was using the most intimate details of my grief as a crowbar. I felt it land. I will not pretend I did not. And then I watched the feeling pass, the way you watch a cloud cross the sun, and the sun is still there when it's gone. I looked at my 3 children, this woman of 51, this man of 48, this woman of 45, and I thought about what it had cost them to come here and say these words. They had swallowed a great deal of pride for this performance. They had coordinated their clothes, their gifts, their arguments, hired a specialist, which meant the prize still mattered enough to swallow all of it. "I appreciate you coming," I said. "I appreciate the coffee cake. And I want you to know that I have heard everything you've said." Linda's shoulders dropped slightly with relief. Premature relief. The kind that comes from confusing silence with agreement. "But I'm not going to change my arrangements," I continued evenly, without raising my voice. "Not the trust, not the will, not the executor. Margaret has reviewed everything thoroughly, and I am satisfied." The warmth in the room curdled instantly, like watching ice form over a pond, visible and swift. Robert set his mug down too hard. Linda's jaw tightened. Patricia's moist eyes dried with a speed that confirmed what I had suspected about them. "Mom," Linda said, and the Richmond voice was gone now. Something flatter and harder underneath it. "Do you understand that if something happens to you, a fall, an illness, Carolyn would be making decisions about your care? Carolyn, who visits twice a year. Is that what you want? A stranger making decisions while we're left standing outside?" "I have a healthcare proxy and an advance directive," I said. "Margaret prepared them. Carolyn has copies. Dr. Marsh has copies." "This attorney has really gotten into your head," Robert said, a muscle working in his cheek. "She's a businesswoman, Mom. You're a client to her. We are your family." "She's helped me think clearly," I said. "There's a difference between someone getting into your head and someone helping you use it." Patricia stood up. She paced to the window, Gerald's window, with the view of his oak tree, 46 years old and solid as anything on this earth, and turned back. Something genuine had broken through the performance, and what was underneath was not love, but frustration, the raw irritation of someone who has run a careful plan and watched it refuse to work. You're being stubborn, and you're going to regret it, Mother. You're isolating yourself from your own family because of paranoia, and one day you will be alone and sick, and you'll wish you'd listened. You'll be in some facility, and Carolyn will be in Asheville, and we won't be allowed to help because you signed papers that shut us out completely. Is that the future you want? The word paranoia was deliberate. So was facility. Every word had been chosen. Even the anger, I suspected, had been at least partially planned. A last resort. The emotional card played when the reasonable ones had failed. You should go, I said. There was a moment. 5, 6 seconds, long enough to feel like a full minute, where no one moved. The sunflowers sat in their vase. The coffee cake sat on its plate. The house was very quiet around us. Then Linda picked up her purse, the motion sharp and final. Robert stood, said nothing, buttoned his jacket with the mechanical precision of a man suppressing a great deal. Patricia stayed by the window a moment longer, looking at me with frustrated fury mixed with something that might, in a different family, have been grief. Then she walked out without another word. I sat in that armchair after they left and felt, for the first time, something unexpected. Fear. Not of them exactly, but of the future Patricia had described. Alone, sick, isolated. It was a vicious image, planted with surgical precision, because she knew me well enough to know exactly where to press. But here is what fear, when it is honest, can do. It can clarify. Every threat they made was a precise measure of how much they stood to lose. And the more they had to lose, the more right I had been to protect myself. Fear was not my enemy. It was information. I picked up my phone and texted Beverly. They came. I held. She replied within 60 seconds. I knew you would. Coffee tomorrow? I replied, yes. Bring the oatmeal cookies. I set the phone down, looked at Gerald's oak through the window, and felt the fear settle into something quieter and more useful. Resolve. The climax came not in my living room, but in Margaret O'Sea's conference room on a Tuesday morning in late July. It was Margaret who had suggested the meeting. She had received information, through proper legal channels, that Robert had contacted Dr. Marsh's office 3 weeks earlier, representing himself on the phone as my primary caregiver and raising concerns about my mental state. He had used that phrase, cognitive episodes. He had suggested that I might be making decisions inconsistent with my best interests. Dr. Marsh's office, to their considerable credit, had not acted on the call, but they had documented it, and Margaret had obtained that documentation. Additionally, Patricia's misdirected text message, combined with 2 subsequent voicemails Linda had left me in which she referenced the need to move things along before it gets legally complicated, had given Margaret enough to formally advise my children, through a certified letter, that she was representing me and that any further attempts to interfere with my legally established financial arrangements or to misrepresent my cognitive status to medical professionals would be met with appropriate legal action. The certified letter had produced a furious response from Linda, who had hired an attorney of her own, a man named Garrett Powell, whose practice was in Richmond and who specialized, his website informed me, in family estate matters. She had sent me a letter through Powell suggesting that my newly established instruments, the trust, the will, might be challengeable on grounds of undue influence, specifically implying that Margaret had manipulated a vulnerable, elderly client. Margaret had read Powell's letter and described it without expression as an overreach. She had then suggested that we invite all 3 of my children, along with Powell if he chose to attend, to a meeting. They came. I arrived at Margaret's office 20 minutes early. I had dressed deliberately. My navy wool blazer, the one I wore to parent-teacher conferences for 30 years, The one Gerald always said made me look like someone who had already decided the outcome of any argument before it began. I sat in the conference room and looked out the window at the parking lot and watched their cars pull in, one by one. Linda's silver Volvo first, then Robert's truck, then the rental Patricia had taken from the airport. They stood briefly together in the parking lot before coming in, a small, instinctive huddle, and I watched them and felt nothing except a calm, clear readiness. Powell was a large, confident man in his mid-50s with silver cufflinks and the practiced ease of someone accustomed to intimidating rooms. Linda sat to his left, composed. Robert was to her right, quieter than I had seen him. The kind of quiet that comes from someone who knows the ground is less solid than it was. Patricia sat at the end of the table, and she had the expression of a person who has been arguing for months and is running low on conviction. Margaret sat across from them. I sat beside Margaret. Margaret opened by placing 3 documents on the table. The first was the documentation from Dr. Marsh's office, the record of Robert's call, with the date, the time, and a summary of what had been said. Robert looked at it. He did not speak. He reached for his water glass, then seemed to think better of it, and put his hand flat on the table instead, as if steadying himself. The second document was a transcript, prepared by a transcription service, of Linda's 2 voicemails. Margaret had played the voicemails themselves into a recording device during a call to my phone, with my knowledge and consent, in a state where one-party consent is legal. Linda's face, reading the transcript, was the color of old chalk. She turned to Powell and said something very low. Powell touched her arm briefly, the gesture of a lawyer telling a client to be quiet. The third document was Patricia's misdirected text, printed and certified. Powell leaned over and spoke quietly to Linda. Linda shook her head once, sharply. "What your clients have described as concern for their mother's welfare," Margaret said, her voice level as a carpenter's rule, "is, in the documented record, a coordinated effort to establish false grounds for a competency challenge, in advance of attempting to obtain power of attorney and control of Mrs. Callahan's assets. The text message alone establishes premeditation. The call to Dr. Marsh's office, with your client identifying himself as her primary caregiver, which he is not, legally or practically, may constitute fraudulent misrepresentation to a medical provider." Powell started to speak. Margaret raised one hand, very slightly, and continued. "Mrs. Callahan's estate instruments are sound. She had a complete cognitive evaluation by Dr. Marsh 6 months ago, at my recommendation, which found her fully competent. The evaluation is on record. Any challenge to the trust or the will on grounds of incapacity or undue influence will fail, and it will fail expensively." She looked at Powell. Powell looked at his cufflinks. "What I would recommend to your clients," Margaret said, "is that they consider carefully whether the cost of litigation, financial, familial, and reputational, is worth a contest they will not win." The silence in that room was the kind that has weight. I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I could hear Patricia breathing. Robert was looking at the surface of the conference table with the focused attention of a man who has run out of options and knows it. Linda had her hands folded in her lap, very still in the way she held herself when she was working very hard to maintain composure. I knew that posture. I had seen it first when she was 9 years old, sitting across from a school principal, trying not to cry. I had not spoken a single word during the meeting. I had sat beside Margaret with my hands folded on the table, and I had looked, in turn, at each of my 3 children. I looked at Linda, who had arranged flowers from my favorite shop. I looked at Robert, who had printed brochures for senior communities. I looked at Patricia, who had cried in my living room and called it love. When Margaret finished, I spoke. I said, quietly and without heat, "I want you to know that I don't hate you, but I want you to understand very clearly that I am not confused. I am not vulnerable. I am not going to sign anything or change anything. And if any of you attempts to involve my doctor, my neighbors, or anyone else in an effort to undermine what I have put in place, Margaret will hear about it before sunset." Robert's jaw worked. Linda looked at the table. Patricia pressed her lips together and looked at the window. Gerald's oak would not have been visible from this room, but she looked toward where trees might be, the way people look away when they have nothing left to say. Powell gathered his papers. He said he would need to consult further with his client. He said it in a way that meant the meeting was over. It was over. Garrett Powell withdrew from the case within 3 weeks of that meeting. Linda received his letter on a Thursday, forwarded it to Robert and Patricia, and called me, I was later told by Carolyn, from her car in a parking garage, where she cried for half an hour. I do not know what she cried about. Her losses, her exposure, her own reflection, perhaps all three. I was not there. I was in my garden, staking tomatoes, my hands in the soil, the late afternoon sun warm on my back. It was, I remember thinking, a very good afternoon. Powell's withdrawal letter cited, in formal language, an unfavorable evidentiary landscape and limited grounds for challenge. What that meant, translated from legal into plain English, was this: the documentation Margaret had assembled made any legal contest not merely difficult, but essentially unwinnable. Robert's call to Dr. Marsh's office, Patricia's misdirected text, Linda's voicemails. Together, they did not merely fail to establish incapacity. They established the opposite, a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation by my children, which would have been far more damaging to their position than helpful to it if the matter ever reached a courtroom. Without legal representation willing to pursue a challenge that the documentation had effectively foreclosed, my children had no mechanism. The trust stood. The will stood. Carolyn remained executor. My healthcare proxy remained in Carolyn's name. Every instrument Margaret and I had put in place held exactly as we had designed it to hold, quietly, firmly, without drama. I received one more letter through official channels, this one from Powell's office, formally confirming withdrawal and stating that his clients would not be pursuing further action. Margaret called me when she received her copy. Her voice was, as always, professionally even, but there was something at the edge of it, a warmth, a quiet satisfaction, that I appreciated more than any formal congratulation would have been. "It's done," she said. "It's done," I agreed. Robert made one final attempt. Not legal, not formal, but personal. He came to the house on a Sunday evening in August, alone, without Linda or Patricia. He sat at Gerald's kitchen table and he looked older than I had ever seen him look, older than his 48 years. The way people look when something they believed about themselves has been disproven, and they haven't yet worked out what to believe instead. He said he was sorry. He said it without qualification, without pivot, without the word but following it. He said he had told himself he was protecting me, and he had known somewhere underneath that it was not entirely true, and he had chosen not to look at what was underneath. I listened to him for a long time. The kitchen was quiet, just the tick of Gerald's old clock on the wall and the sound of the evening settling in. I believed Robert, partially. He had always been the most conflicted of the three, the one most capable of a certain kind of honesty when cornered by it, the one who had occasionally, over the years, called me simply to talk, not because he wanted something, but because he was lonely or uncertain, and I was his mother. That Robert was still in there somewhere, underneath the man who had called my doctor with false information. I could not pretend otherwise. But I also could not pretend the other thing had not happened. I told him that I heard him. I told him that I did not know yet what our relationship would look like going forward, and that he would have to live with that uncertainty for a while, because I was not prepared to reassure him before I was ready. He needed to understand that his remorse, however genuine, did not erase what had been planned. What would have happened to me, to this house, to everything Gerald and I had built, if I had not stood in that dark hallway on a Thursday night in April and listened? He nodded. He left. It was the most honest conversation we had had in years, possibly ever. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his truck disappear down Maple Creek Road. And I felt something complicated. Not forgiveness, not quite, but the first loosening of the knot that had been in my chest since spring. Linda did not call or visit for 4 months. When she finally called, in December, she was polite and surface level and did not mention any of it. I responded in kind. We spoke about her garden and the weather in Richmond. It was the beginning of something. Not forgiveness exactly, but a form of civility that might, over time, if she chose to tend it honestly, grow into something more. Patricia was the hardest. She sent a card in September, a brief, formal card, the kind you send to an acquaintance, that said only, "I hope you are well, Mom." I sent one back that said the same. It was not enough, but it was something to work from, if she ever chose to do the work. The most important outcome, the one that mattered practically and permanently, was what had been secured. The house on Maple Creek Road was held in trust, protected, outside the reach of anyone who might claim I had given it away in a moment of confusion. My accounts were structured. My will was clear. My healthcare decisions were in the hands of someone I trusted and who had no financial stake in the outcome. Margaret sent me a final bill in October. I paid it, happily, completely, without a moment's hesitation, and sent her a handwritten note that said simply, "Thank you for taking me seriously." She sent back a card. It read, "You took yourself seriously first. That's why it worked." I kept that card on the mantle, next to the photograph of Gerald and me on our 25th anniversary. Standing in front of this house, in front of the oak tree that was then only 23 years old and not yet taller than the roof. Every morning, making my coffee, I looked at that card. And every morning, it said the same true thing. That autumn was one of the best I can remember. I planted a new flower bed along the south side of the house, something I had been putting off for 3 years. And Beverly came over 2 Saturdays in a row to help me dig. We made a mess of Gerald's old gardening gloves and laughed about it. Frank DeLuca repaired my back fence and accepted a loaf of cranberry bread instead of payment. Pastor Ann and I began meeting for coffee on the first Wednesday of every month, which became something I looked forward to with unreasonable fondness. I signed up in January for a watercolor class at the Millbrook Community Arts Center. I had not painted since before Gerald died. I was not good at it. My water tends to run, and my color sense, according to my instructor Priya, is exuberant. I did not mind being exuberant. Carolyn visited in February. She drove up from Asheville and spent 4 days, sleeping in the guest room, eating my cooking, walking with me in the evenings. She was easy to be with in the way that people are easy when they want nothing from you. On the last night, we sat at Gerald's table with a bottle of wine and talked until midnight. She said she was honored to be named in the documents and hoped she never had to act on any of it for a very long time. I told her I hoped the same. My days had a shape again. Morning coffee in Gerald's kitchen, the radio low, light through the east window. Watercolor on Tuesdays. church on Sundays, Beverly on Wednesdays, a call with Carolyn every other week. At my regular appointment, Dr. Marsh noted with genuine pleasure that my blood pressure was better than it had been in 2 years. I slept well. That was not a small thing. As for my children, life arranged its own consequences, as it tends to do. Linda's husband, Craig, discovered that autumn that she had been quietly moving their joint household money into a personal account without his knowledge, through a paper statement that arrived while she was out of town. I learned of it from a mutual cousin at Christmas. The irony was not lost on me. Linda, who had sat in my living room strategizing about consolidating my assets, had been running the same play at home. Craig filed for separation in November. The process was expensive and unpleasant. Robert lost his position at the logistics company where he had worked for 12 years. Something about expense reports, a company card used for personal purchases. He called in February asking to borrow money. I declined gently and gave him the name of a financial counselor Margaret had recommended. He did not mention the money when he finally called again 2 months later. Patricia's unraveling in Denver was quieter. She had been passed over twice for an expected promotion, and her second serious relationship in 3 years had ended badly. I knew through Carolyn, who maintained a wider family correspondence than I did not reach out to gloat. But I noticed, with quiet acknowledgement, that the futures my children had been so certain of had not arranged themselves as expected. I thought about the oak tree in the backyard. Gerald had planted it the year Robert was born, and it was now the tallest thing on the property. He had known he would never see it fully grown. He had planted it anyway. For me, I understood now. For the years after him. For the woman who would sit under it, gather herself, and go on. I went on. Here is what 50 years taught me, and what one April night confirmed. What would you have done standing in that dark hallway? Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe. There are more where this came from. Thank you for listening. It meant everything.